is about a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. And she takes the pink seed and she puts it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she comes and she's looking at her flower boxes, and what she notices is that every single one of the red seeds has sprouted. And some of the seed is tall, some of the red flowers are tall and strong and flourishing. The weak seed in the red at least has sprouted and made it to a middling height. But when she looks in the pink box, in that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died, and the strong pink seed is just struggling to make it to a middling height. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens, until finally, 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes, and she says, "You know, I was right to prefer red over pink." Now, we'll interrupt that to say that this first part of the story is how institutionalized racism works. You had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil. You had the flower boxes, the contemporary structural factors, keeping the soil separate. And then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of that difference. But now we're going to pick the story back up and say, well, where would personally mediated racism be in this garden? Well, that's when the gardener's looking at her flowers, and she says, "Those pink flowers are so scraggly and scrawny," and she plucks those blossoms off before they can even go to seed. Or she might notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, and she plucks it out before it can establish itself. And then where would internalized racism be in this garden? Well, you have the pink flowers in their box trying to make it, looking over at red, which is all flourishing and flaunted. And here come the bees, and the bees are minding their own business. They're just collecting nectar, but they're pollinating at the same time, so the bees are buzzing around. So here come the bees to the pink flowers, bzz, bzz, and it comes over to this one pink flower, bzz, and the pink flower says, "Get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red," because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So then the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, you could say, well, let's address the internalized racism. So we're going to go over to the pink flowers and we're going to say, "Pink is beautiful, power to the pink," which might make the pink flowers feel better, but that in and of itself is not going to change the conditions in which they live. Or you could say, okay, well, I understand that. Let's address the personally mediated racism. So let's go talk to the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, which is all good. But we're going to say, "Dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink blossoms?" And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. What you really need to do if you want to set things right in this garden is to address the institutionalized racism. So you have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's okay too, although to me it makes it easier to segregate resources. But if you want to keep separate boxes, then you have to enrich that poor, rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich, fertile soil. And when you do that, you know the pink flowers will flourish. They will look grand and beautiful and wonderful, maybe even better than the red, because they have, after all, been selected for survival and strength, which is a very, very interesting notion. And then once those pink flowers are flourishing, they'll no longer be looking over at red, wanting to be red. So you'll have also addressed the internalized racism. And in addressing the institutionalized racism, you may even address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink. But her children, seeing the flowers equally beautiful, would be less likely to adopt that attitude. So this story has very quickly been to illustrate these 3 levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. We can address the other levels at the same time, but we have to at least address the institutionalized racism, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. There's just one last piece to this story, which is the important question: who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I've given the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources. And who is this gardener really? Well, certainly government is part of the gardener. You know, sometimes I joke and say, well, maybe the rich people behind government are part of the gardener. Maybe we can be our own gardener in communities if we have this power to decide, power to act, and control of resources, which is what I also describe as self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, whoever's going to have this power, it's very important that the gardener be concerned with equity. If the gardener's not concerned with equity, then you'll have the scrawny-looking pink flowers and the pretty red flowers, and the gardener will be thinking that the garden is beautiful when in fact it is not.